A mouse can squeeze through a gap no wider than a pencil, and once inside your home, it will chew through wood, wiring, and insulation without ever being seen. There is a way to seal every one of those gaps permanently, without a single trap, without a drop of poison, and it costs less than a takeaway meal. I grew up in a stone farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales, the kind of house with walls 2 feet thick, and gaps in the mortar that had been there since before my grandfather was born. He was the one who taught me how to keep mice out, not with clever gadgets, but with 2 ordinary things most households already had in a kitchen drawer or a gardening shed. I watched him do it every autumn without fail before the first frost came down off the fells, and in all the years I lived in that house, I never once saw a mouse cross the threshold. These were not theories to him. They were simply how things were done, passed down the way a recipe is passed down. Tested by people who could not afford to get it wrong. I am sharing this now because fewer and fewer people know it, and I think that is worth putting right. Somewhere along the way, keeping mice out of a home became a business, and a fairly profitable one at that. Poison bait stations, ultrasonic plug-in devices, call-out fees for pest control vans. All of it built on the idea that rodents are a problem you manage rather than a problem you solve. The truth my grandfather understood, and the truth country people understood for generations before him, is that a mouse cannot chew through what it cannot get its teeth into, and it will not walk through a scent that punishes its nose. Once you seal the entry and poison the air against them, there is very little left for anyone to sell you. What I am about to walk you through is not a theory, and it is not something I read in a book. It was tested across hundreds of winters, in farmhouses and cottages where a mouse infestation could mean spoiled grain and a hungry family. By people who had no counsel to call and no money for an exterminator. It worked then, and it still works now, and I am going to show you exactly how, one step at a time. The first thing to understand is why a mouse chooses your home in the first place, and it has very little to do with mess or cleanliness, whatever you may have been told. A mouse is looking for 3 things, and only 3 things: warmth, a food source it can smell from outside, and a gap small enough to feel safe squeezing through but wide enough to fit its skull. Because where the skull goes, the body follows. Their skeletons are built for this, their ribs able to collapse inward, and a fully grown house mouse can pass through an opening about the width of your smallest finger, roughly 6 millimeters across. That is not a wide gap. That is the kind of gap you find around a pipe that was never quite sealed properly, or where old mortar has shrunk and pulled away from a window frame, or beneath a door that has warped half a centimeter over 30 years of English damp. My grandfather used to say that a mouse does not break into a house, it simply notices the house was never properly closed. And once you understand that, the whole problem looks different. You are not fighting an invasion, you are correcting an oversight. And that is a job any person can do with a bit of patience and the right materials. The second step, and this is where most people go wrong before they even begin, is finding every single entry point rather than just the obvious ones. Most homeowners walk the outside of their house once, spot the big gap under the back door, seal that, and consider the job finished. But a determined mouse only needs one overlooked crack, and old English houses in particular are full of them, especially anything built before the 1950s. When foundations were laid without the damp proofing and sealing standards we have today, walk the entire perimeter of your home slowly at ground level and get down on your knees if you have to. Look at every point where a pipe, a cable, or a vent passes through an outside wall, because the hole cut for that pipe is almost always larger than the pipe itself, leaving a gap all the way around it. Check where the foundation meets the siding or the brickwork. Check around basement windows. Check the corners where an extension was added to an older building, because those seams rarely match up perfectly. Check the gaps around your garage door, the space where your dryer vent exits the wall, and anywhere a utility line enters from outside. My grandfather kept a torch by the back door for exactly this purpose, and every September, before the weather turned, he would walk that same route around the house, tapping the mortar with the handle, listening for the hollow sound that told him something had shifted. That is only the first part of getting this right. The second part, the part most people never think to try, is understanding why steel wool works when so many other barrier materials fail within weeks. Homeowners have tried stuffing gaps with all sorts of things over the years, expanding foam, old rags, even crumpled newspaper. And every one of those fails for the same reason. A mouse's front teeth, its incisors, never stop growing for its entire life, which means it must gnaw constantly simply to keep them worn down to a manageable length. Soft materials do not resist that gnawing. They invite it, because chewing through foam or fabric is effortless and even satisfies the animal's need to file its teeth. Steel wool is different because it is made of fine strands of actual metal, and metal does not compress or tear the way foam does. When a mouse attempts to bite through it, the fibers do not give way, and worse for the mouse. The sharp metal edges catch and irritate the soft tissue inside its mouth. Within a few attempts, most mice abandon the effort entirely, because the discomfort outweighs whatever reward waits on the other side. This is a method that goes back well before modern pest control existed at all, and country households used it because it was already sitting in their tool shed, used for scouring pots or preparing timber, and it cost almost nothing to put to a second purpose. Now, the specifics matter here because not all steel wool works equally well. You want a coarse grade, the kind labeled Grade 0 or Grade 1, sold in most hardware shops for cleaning cast iron pans or preparing wood before staining. Avoid the very fine grades meant for polishing metal, because those are softer and finer strands that a determined mouse can work through with more patience. Buy it in the long, loosely bound rolls rather than the small pre-cut pads, because you will need generous lengths to properly pack each gap. Once you have your steel wool, take a strip roughly the length of your forearm and twist it firmly into a loose rope, dense enough to hold its shape, but not so tightly wound that you cannot still work it into an irregular gap. Push it into the opening using a flathead screwdriver or a similar blunt tool, packing it in firmly enough that no visible daylight passes through, and leaving no soft pockets where a persistent mouse might find purchase. For larger gaps, layer several strips rather than trying to force one large clump through, because a well-packed, even barrier resists far better than a loosely stuffed one. Do this at every single entry point you identified during your walk around the house, not just the ones that look the most obvious, because a mouse only needs the one you missed. That covers the physical barrier, but on its own. Steel wool is only half the method, and this next part is where most people are genuinely surprised by how effective it becomes. A mouse experiences the world primarily through scent, far more than through sight. And its sense of smell is many times more sensitive than a human's. Peppermint oil, in high concentration, overwhelms that sense entirely. The compound responsible, menthol, irritates the delicate lining of a rodent's nasal passage in a way it simply does not for us, and where we find the smell pleasant, a mouse finds it genuinely distressing. This is not folk superstition. It has been observed and written about since Victorian times, when country households used strong-smelling herbs like mint and later concentrated oils, tucked into pantries and grain stores to discourage vermin from settling in. During wartime rationing, when poison was scarce and every grain of stored food mattered enormously, this kind of scent barrier became a household staple rather than a curiosity, because families could not afford to lose what little food they had put by. The method survived because it worked reliably enough to be worth repeating year after year in homes that had no other option. To use it properly, you want a high-potency peppermint essential oil, not a diluted room fragrance or a scented candle, but a concentrated oil sold for aromatherapy or household use. Take small cotton wool balls, the same soft cotton you might use for cleaning, and saturate each one thoroughly until the oil has soaked all the way through, rather than sitting only on the surface. Place these saturated balls directly against and around every steel wool barrier you have packed into the walls, as well as inside cupboards. Along skirting boards and near any other opening you are unable to seal completely, such as air bricks or ventilation grills. Renew them roughly every 2 to 3 weeks, because the scent fades as the oil evaporates, and a faded barrier is no barrier at all. Now here is the part that matters most, and it is the reason this method has lasted as long as it has, so keep listening, because putting these two elements together is what makes the whole approach permanent rather than temporary. Used alone, steel wool blocks the body, but does nothing to discourage a mouse from investigating nearby. And it may simply search elsewhere along the same wall for another way in. Used alone, peppermint oil discourages the nose, but does nothing to stop a determined mouse that has already found a physical gap it can fit through. Together, they form what my grandfather used to call a proper seal. a barrier the mouse cannot pass through, even if it wanted to, and a smell so unpleasant that it never wants to in the first place. Pack the steel wool first, firmly and completely, then place the saturated cotton immediately around and against it, so the scent greets the mouse before it even reaches the metal. This layering matters because a mouse that smells danger before it commits to the gap will turn away long before it discovers whether the barrier could be chewed through at all. Do this at every point of entry, consistently. Rather than treating one or two obvious gaps and assuming the job is finished, beyond the foundation and the walls, there are several other areas in an English home that deserve the same attention, and homeowners overlook them constantly. The chimney is one of the most common overlooked roots, particularly in older cottages with open flues, and a simple wire mesh cap fitted at the top, combined with steel wool packed around the damper opening, closes that root entirely. Loft spaces and eaves are another weak point, especially where roof tiles meet the guttering, and a torch inspection on a dry afternoon will usually reveal small gaps where daylight is visible from inside the loft. Vents and air bricks need particular care because they must remain open for proper ventilation. But fitting a fine mesh screen behind the vent, combined with a few strands of steel wool woven through the mesh itself, allows air to pass while still blocking a mouse's path. Door thresholds, especially on older doors that have settled and warped over the decades, often leave a gap along the bottom that a folded strip of steel wool, tucked beneath a simple draft excluder, will close without needing to replace the door itself. Even garages and outbuildings deserve the same treatment, because a mouse that establishes itself in a shed or garage is often only a season away from finding its way into the main house through a shared wall or utility gap. Take the time to walk every one of these areas the same way you walked the foundation, methodically and without rushing, because thoroughness is what separates a home that stays mouse-free from one that sees the same problem return every winter. Once the barriers are in place, the work is not entirely finished. And this final step is the one that determines whether your effort lasts a single season or many years. Steel wool, being metal, will eventually begin to rust if it is exposed to damp conditions over a long period, particularly in gaps near guttering or ground level where moisture collects. Check your barriers twice a year, once in early autumn before mice begin actively seeking shelter from the cold, and once again in spring, replacing any strips that have rusted through or loosened over time. Renew your peppermint oil applications on the same schedule I mentioned earlier, roughly every 2 to 3 weeks during the autumn and winter months, when mice are most active and most motivated to find their way indoors, and you can extend that to once a month through the milder summer period. Keep a small record, if it helps you, the way my grandfather kept his mental note of which corner of the house needed checking first, because a barrier you forget about is a barrier that slowly stops working. This routine, done consistently, is what turns a one-time fix into a permanent solution, and it asks very little of you once it becomes habit. When I think back on it now, what strikes me most is how simple the whole approach really was, and how little it asked of anyone beyond a bit of time and attention. We have been sold the idea that keeping our homes safe from pests requires chemicals, contracts, and call-out fees, when in truth, it required nothing more than understanding how the animal actually behaves and closing the door properly, in every sense of the word. There is a quiet satisfaction in solving a problem with your own 2 hands, using things you likely already have in your home, rather than reaching for the telephone or the wallet. That satisfaction was ordinary once, something every household simply expected of itself, and I think it is worth having again. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same kind of knowledge my grandfather passed down to me. Methods that were never really lost, only set aside. The old ways are still here. You just have to know where to look.